Welcome to the Environmental Leadership Chronicles, a podcast brought to you by the California Association of Environmental Professionals. In this episode, we have a panel of experts in environmental policy and planning who joined to discuss the CEQA Fair Argument Standard. Corinne Lytle Bonine has over 18 years of environmental permitting experience and serves as the Director of Environmental Permitting for the Western Region and Wind nationwide at AES. She also serves as the Administrative Vice President for AEP's State Board of Directors. Kristin Blackson has extensive knowledge as an environmental planner. With 25 years of experience, she's a CEQA practitioner, educator, and active participant in California's environmental policy conversations. Kristin is also the Director-at-Large on AEP's State Board of Directors. And Matt Klopfenstein is co-founder and partner at Summit Advocacy, a lobbyist specializing in CEQA, energy, and environmental policy work, who works extensively with the California legislature. Together, they'll share their perspectives on the Fair Argument Standard, including what it means, how it's applied, and why it matters for environmental professionals across California. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoy.
This is Corinne Lytle Bonine, and I am joined today with two special guests who I will let introduce themselves shortly, but I'm really excited to discuss in our latest CEQA series, the Fair Argument Standard. So our guest today, Kristin Blackson, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Kristin Blackson. I have been a CEQA practitioner for 25 plus years now. And I started my work with the County of San Diego. So that's where most of my experience and stories come from, is with this public agency. I also teach CEQA with UC San Diego Extension, our CEQA certificate course. So that CEQA, I'm all CEQA all the time, and I'll pass it on to Matt.
Hello, my name is Matt Klopfenstein, founder of a lobbying firm up in Sacramento, California called Summit Advocacy. I have been lobbying and consulting on CEQA issues, including representing AEP in Sacramento for about a dozen years, and work on CEQA, land use, energy, and other environmental issues, among other things, and really glad to be with you all today.
Great. Thanks, Kristin and Matt. Super excited to have you both here today to talk about the pesky little Fair Argument Standard and really go over what it is, why we care, and maybe, why are CEQA practitioners and maybe, people a little further from straight up CEQA practitioners hearing a little bit about it in the news and what it means for our practice of the California Environmental Quality Act. So real quick overview. When we say the Fair Argument Standard, what we mean is the level of judicial review given in, affirming or disproving environmental impact conclusions in our environmental documents, and where it has become and a matter of maybe, let's say, increasing importance in CEQA practice is that through a series of court cases, as well as, judicial interpretation of legislative intent, our mitigated negative declarations and negative declarations, or MNDs and NDs, have been afforded this fair argument standard when reviewed at the judicial level. That means that, any fair argument that can be made that an environmental impact is significant or potentially significant would mean that instead of an MND or an ND being prepared, an environmental impact report, or EIR, is the more appropriate document. So in practice, that means that as we are looking at initial impact assessments for our projects and in our environmental documents, we're not only assessing the impacts themselves, but a lot of times what practitioners are forced to do is look at what are the chances that this document is going to get sued or has the potential to get sued. And that will cause maybe a switch to doing that higher level environmental impact report review, again, not based on the level of impacts, assessed for the project, but What do we think is going to happen if this gets taken to a judge or a court? So, super high level overview there. I will turn it over to our guests to get into a little more details. And of course, want to give a shameless plug to our legislative committee for AEP, led by both Matt and Kristin, who have really, I think, over the last couple of years done an excellent job of bringing one of AEP's identified issues of, gosh, what would we really like to see in CEQA reform? And we've seen this, change in how judicial review occurs for MNDs, NDs happen, come to the top of that list. So like we've previewed, we've had some exciting advancements over the last couple of years in this fair argument standard, kind of understanding and what it could mean for CEQA practitioners. But before we get to that, let me turn it over to, and first ask Kristin, what planning or projects in your experience have either been changed or been subject to limitations given this application of the fair argument standard to NDs or MNDs?
Thanks for asking. So my background and experience is a unique perspective in that when I started my career, as I mentioned, at the County of San Diego as a lead agency staffer processing projects through the CEQA process, it was at a time when we were seeing expanded CEQA review, a lot of attention, not only to my county and my lead jurisdiction, but across California. I was looking at previous EIRs, from the 80s and early 90s that were a few pages, right? And those got challenged. And so at this time, we were seeing a lot more attention paid to CEQA by the community and by the CEQA process in general. So in process, and also as my experience is, I just wanted to always do this efficiently. I saw how the process could get bogged down by not only, lead agency processes, but, the process of CEQA itself. So early on in my career, I just started off, I got to do this better. How do we do this better? And one of the areas that I recognized was that how opponents to projects were causing the fair argument to be raised, right? I would process a few different projects through the system as an MND, and rightfully so. These were minor projects that fit in with the general plan, did not need amendments or rezones, or were just regulating within the rules and did not result in an obvious significant impact. For example, and they were being challenged and asked to do an EIR because they were raising this fair argument that a significant impact was going to occur. But it was not really based on significant impacts. It was based on other reasonings, such as opposition, very simple as a pizza parlor going in asking for a CEQA permit, and the neighboring pizza parlor challenging that MND so that pizza parlor didn't get to go in, or that pizza parlor had to spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars extra on permitting for their pizza parlor. So it's a rough, it's a rough example, but it did happen. Believe me. We got challenged, and these are the kinds of projects that don't get into our numbers, right? They don't go to courts. They are just chased away. They withdraw, and they're out of the system. So there's no way for us as CEQA practitioners to even see or to check a box to see if the fair argument was rightfully so applied, or if it was just an area of controversy, which is supposed to be not part of the fair argument standard. So I feel like, and AEP feels like, this is an area where we can clarify and be more efficient in our processing our process by standardizing all these reviews. So it wouldn't be different from an MND. It wouldn't be different from the standard review from an exemption, or what is determined to be a significant effect is the same across each CEQA document. So that's where we're coming from. And
Kristin, when you say the same, we talk about why we would shift to an EIR and what it means. And, we talk a lot about the substantial evidence standard as opposed to the fair argument standard. And could you provide just a little bit more detail for our listeners who may be less familiar with that on, what is really that difference between substantial evidence and fair argument, and, why having that same consistent standard of review applied is so important?
Well, the standard of review should be, like we said, should be the same. The fair argument's existence comes up when we're talking about if an agency within the realm of an MND there is one argument that says there's no significant impact, and there's another argument that says it is, and it automatically get raised. But in any other situation, it is your best argument, right? And the lead agency has deference to determine the argument that supports the significant impact conclusion. So substantial evidence is used in that manner. And so that is what we're asking for as that standard across the board for all CEQA documents. How did I do, Corinne?
Nailed it. And I think, I use this example a little bit tongue in cheek, but I think it is illustrative where, when you look at, let's say, adding lighting to a high school stadium, and, we have seen CEQA litigation that, on an ND or MND to do that, had, let's say, extensive simulations demonstrating what lighting would look like, showed views from houses, provided, what I think some would say was substantial evidence that, lighting from temporary events would not be a significant environmental impact. But because it was an MND that was selected to do this work, the court could not apply that substantial evidence to it. So all the 17 simulations that were done for a project like this held the same weight in the way the court decided as one public comment essentially saying, I think this is ugly. And that, is, again, a little bit tongue in cheek, but somewhat illustrative of what these NDs and MNDs are up against when that fair argument standard is applied, and why we think, elevating the standard of review to substantial evidence is so important.
Yes, there's a process for opposing projects and providing evidence that a project may have a significant impact on the environment, right? So then none of that goes away with the fair argument going away. The use of the fair argument, like in your example and my example, can get often more nefarious, and slated as other, areas to oppose a project, which have nothing to do with land use. And then I'll give my plug for my class. In my class, I use fair argument and a project that that was proposed in the county of San Diego, and the community opposing it. And the class is asked to evaluate some of these arguments and determine if that standard was reached, or if it was, just existence of public controversy, or just because somebody doesn't like it does not mean that it is a fair argument against a project. Or not, I shouldn't say against a project, that a project would have a significant impact.
Yeah, in some way, it's been a victim of its own success in the public eye, because I think when it was created in the 70s by the courts, it was intended to make sure local governments weren't, intentionally ignoring environmental concerns and kind of like sweeping those under the rug. And then it became such an effective way to kick things into further review that then it started to get abused a bit.
Yeah.
And then for both of you, what do you see are the impacts of, a continuation of business as usual and having the fair argument standard continue to apply to MNDs or NDs?
I think there's an open question about that that may be before voters later this year. Certainly is something that policymakers in Sacramento have discussed. It's kind of funny to think back. I know both of you have been involved with the legislative committee for a number of years. 10 years ago, CEQA was untouchable. I mean, there was no desire among legislators. It was a third rail issue. You did not make significant amendments to CEQA. And as I think mostly it's been driven by housing and litigation affecting housing projects has really turned the conversation in Sacramento. And I think one of the things that AEP has tried to educate and has been a bit concerned with is, rather than doing the harder work to figure out how to put in place the proper standards that have the proper incentives to do the appropriate environmental review, the legislature has been able to, or has trended towards just exempting certain classes of projects. And so they've kind of gotten around the fair argument standard issue, aka the very easy to sue and drive projects into more review issue, by just exempting classes of projects from CEQA review altogether. And that trend started 7 or 8 years ago, and has really just picked up steam every single year since then.
And I would add, not doing so in the most clear manner, right? To be polite.
We love our legislators, but what comes at the end of the sausage making isn't always crystal clear. Totally agree, Kristin. And then I think also there's a bit of an environmental justice argument too, for how the fair argument standard is being applied. And you do have projects that can't afford to go through an EIR. Mm-hmm. And when coming back to our school district example, if you're a school district with limited funds and you're being asked to, double, triple, quadruple the amount of budget that you have on a, CEQA document, that's going to be much harder for a, traditionally underserved school district than it would be for a well-funded school district. And it does mean that, that stadium lighting project or whatever the project isn't getting done because CEQA can't be complied with in a way that, makes sense for all school districts. And I think that there's, lots of other examples as well about, good projects being asked to bear the burden of costs, associated with it. I think a victim of its own success was a great way to say it, Matt.
Agreed. And some of the smaller projects and communities aren't getting done, and those communities aren't getting some of the services or some of the complete land uses that they need.
Yeah. And so considering, I'm sorry, go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, last year was kind of the first year that the legislature fully, I think, appreciated and took on the fair argument standard. There was a bill proposed by Senator Wiener last year, SB 607, that had intended to essentially do what AEP had been talking about, which is shift the standard for challenging a MND or ND to the normal standard, substantial evidence, as opposed to this fair argument standard. And the legislative process last year, as it related to CEQA bills, became an entirely fascinating thing in and of itself. So I won't go into all those details, but SB 607 eventually got brought together with several other very significant CEQA-related and kind of environmental housing-related bills that all got discussed by leadership and all of a sudden popped out as part of what we call budget trailer bills. And those ended up being AB 130 and SB 131, which many of our listeners may already be familiar with those and trying to figure out how they're going to comply with them or make use of them. While several components from SB 607, Senator Wiener's bill that included a number of exemptions and things, including the fair argument tweak, some of those made it into SB 131, and then some did not. And one of the ones that did not make it into that final budget bill was the fair argument standard shift to substantial evidence. And so what we saw instead as kind of a way to, again, I think legislatures trying to work around this issue to not upset too significantly those entities that like to challenge projects, is they created a new what they call a near miss provision, where if a project is close to being eligible for an exemption, but has a quote near miss, then they only have to analyze that one provision that makes it not eligible for streamlining. And that was seen as their way of trying to get around this, one of the ways to try and get projects around this fair argument challenge, while still having, some amount of CEQA review.
And a clear example of where a clear and transparent and solid M&D process would replace these near miss exemptions, because they do still require extensive amounts of analysis. And it is unclear, right, what they're constructed of and what the near miss might be, where we already have a clear process in our initial studies that has, clear thresholds. And so I think it's an example of how the fair argument could have solved what they were seeking to solve with that exemption. What do you think, Matt, is the main opposition to removing the fair argument that you hear about in Sacramento?
Yeah, it's a good question. There have been a lot over the years. There have been a lot of proposals and discussions about how to address CEQA litigation. And that's usually what people point to as the biggest concern, is abusive litigation or litigation that just elongates project timelines so much that they eventually just go away. And those entities that are the ones who do a lot of that litigation are influential in Sacramento. And so I think the biggest pushback has been not wanting to be seen as disenfranchising maybe local environmental groups or environmental justice groups or labor unions who have a lot of political power from being able to kind of participate in the CEQA process and challenge projects that they don't like for whatever reason. And so rather than kind of taking on that access to litigation fight, they have just decided to focus on, okay, what are the types of projects that we in Sacramento like and want to see more of? And let's just make it really easy to build those projects. Everything that doesn't fit into those boxes, it's, still subject to the normal process and the, potential litigation and all those things. We're not disenfranchising anybody. But that's kind of been the workaround to avoid those kind of, big legal fights.
I think, with that and considering the impacts we've seen, Kristin, if you have a magic wand, and we could streamline legislation without any opposition, what would you like to see? What is your perfect world fix for this issue we've identified?
I think how they had it before they revised it in the SV with the SB 607, Matt, or which is removal of the text and revising to elevate the substantial evidence standard and as that for each CEQA document. But some textual revisions, but I believe they had it right the first time that SB 607 was presented, or one of the first times. One of the variations had it right. But really just, the removal of that text and standard from CEQA.
And then during that, Kristin, how meaningful would it be for you as a practitioner to essentially have MNDs and NDs become available again to you? I don't know if it's possible to put an estimate to it or both in terms of maybe cost savings, schedule savings, or really have that tool at your disposal again. Whereas now it might not be, or maybe even in just limited circumstances.
Well, I mean, as we said, in my practice, I have seen, the opposition or the fair argument standard used to elevate either a project into an EIR or a project just goes away. And I do think that's faulty because I do think there's, I don't say majority, I have no idea percentage wise, but there is a good substantial amount of projects that would benefit from this transparent process that goes through all the resource areas to a scale that is applicable to their project and what they're impacting. Again, the EIR is still available for projects with significant impacts. So this opens up and reiterates and cements this process that we already have for projects that would not result in significant unmitigated impacts in projects that don't need to look at a giant cumulative analysis. Cumulative impacts are still considered in an MND, but not to the extent as they are in an EIR. Moreover, projects that don't need the full alternative analysis. I've had projects where I'm analyzing that should be MNDs that are EIRs, and we're struggling to find alternatives because there is no impacts of the project. But we have to do an EIR because we have to spend this additional funds, labor, time, schedule on creating alternatives for a project that really would benefit from an NMD process. What do you think, Corinne? Is that your experience?
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Kristin. And, the way that I've looked at it is, really doing this will, I think, restore kind of the original intent of these, categories of CEQA documents where we're having, the level of effort, level of documentation be commensurate with the level of impact. And it takes away that, debate or struggle that we have as CEQA practitioners of, do we think we're getting sued, and letting that dictate what level of review we're given a project. And I completely agree that the MND ND is proven, it's clear, it's concise, and I think your point about alternatives is spot on. It also sometimes can create kind of unintended consequences and have right for more legal challenge, since alternatives is something that can be sued quite easily. So some of these projects are getting double hit because of the structure that the courts have put MNDs and the fair argument in.
Yeah, agreed.
And then, Matt, another thing that AEP has been following very closely, and a plug for the really detailed email communication that we've given out that we have a lot of member interest in, is the Cal Chambers ballot initiative, and what is happening there, what could happen there, and lo and behold, there's even a little piece about the fair argument standard. So could you walk us through what the Cal Chambers ballot initiative is, and specifically how it relates to the fair argument standard?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I think it's part of this kind of trend that I was alluding to earlier of, CEQA being a third rail issue 10 years ago to now every year being an accelerating, maybe attack is too strong of a word, but taking big bites out of CEQA. Initially with very narrow exemptions, and then broader and broader exemptions, and some changes to process, and now a potential ballot measure that the voters will get to decide on that would, really dramatically change CEQA for a big cross section of projects. And so I won't go into all the details of the ballot measure. There's a lot in there. But I'll give the 30-second highlight to then be able to talk about the fair argument tweak that it makes. It would essentially create seven different classes of projects, and then say that if you meet the requirements for those projects, which are very broad in the water, housing, electricity, you name it, issues, healthcare, all kinds of projects included in here. If you meet the requirements, which again are pretty broad requirements, then you are protected from CEQA litigation in a very significant way. Your environmental review is very streamlined, both in terms of timing and what has to go into that environmental review. And then you're subject to changes in terms of what alternatives you have to analyze. And then I think most significantly is the standard of review, if your project is challenged, is dramatically different than it is now. And I should have said the proponent of this is the California Chamber of Commerce, for those who don't know who Cal Chamber is. And so they were the ones who drafted this and are actively gathering signatures right now. Specific to a fair argument standard, essentially what they do is remove the fair argument standard of review for these projects. And they instead require, well, they use fair argument, but in the opposite way, essentially, where if the lead agency has a fair argument that is backed up by substantial evidence, then their decision is upheld. So it essentially gives a lot more discretion to the agency decision and very, very significantly narrows and really eliminates any judicial discretion that can be used in looking at CEQA challenges for these types of projects. I think it specifically says judges can only rely on objective analyses, so they cannot kind of wade beyond what is specifically called out in the ballot measure.
Great, thanks, Matt. And I should say that, AEP has had communications sharing some information about this. We have done so, for awareness and education purposes. We are a professional organization, so we don't take advocacy positions on ballot initiatives, but at the same time, we believe that CEQA is grounded in transparency and informed analysis, and we do want our members to certainly be aware of what's going on and make sure that you all have access to and can make informed decisions if and when the ballot measure appears on our ballots.
Yeah, and I should have said, so they are collecting signatures now, and I would not blame many of our listeners if they don't follow the process for how a ballot measure gets on a ballot, but they have to present to the Secretary of State up around 1 million signatures around the end of April. They have to get those certified, and then if they hit the threshold, then this measure would appear on the November ballot.
So I think, Kristin, Matt, kind of in conclusion and looking at your crystal balls is where do you think we'll be, let's say the end of, whether it's election season, whether it's this legislative session, can't venture a guess of whether or not we'll be pouring one out for the fair argument standard or, living to fight another year legislative session with the tools we have at our disposal now.
Well, I certainly hope we have and that we continue this legislative season with the fair argument on the table. Like Matt said, last year was the first year that it was actually in legislation, that it was on the table, and we were so excited. And I'm so excited, right? This is part of what we do as part of the legislative committee. Is go to Capitol Days. We meet with Matt and he takes us to different legislators and we talk about this. And I think part of this podcast, what I wanted to do with this podcast is we just got to keep talking about this particular part of CEQA and how we feel like or how we believe in our experience that it really can help us with, as practitioners and applicants get through the process. without necessarily amending, CEQA in such a dramatic ways. I think that's part of the message. And that's why I'm happy we're doing the podcast. And that's how I'm happy to go back to Sacramento in a few weeks to discuss this. I hope it's back on the table. But yeah, it's something I will continue to advocate for until it gets done.
Yeah, I do think there's an opportunity in the legislature this year to put together a policy that gets at the litigation components of CEQA and potentially could avoid the need for a big ballot measure fight this November. We'll see if there is a political appetite to try and find some kind of compromise that gets at those issues. So I think it's anyone's guess if that happens. If they move forward with the ballot measure and assuming it eventually passes, the interesting thing is then the fair argument standard will live on for all the other projects that don't fall within the parameters of the ballot measure. So interestingly, it will protect the fair argument standard probably into the future for all the non-ballot measure projects. So kind of a funny result, but anyone's guess how this year's going to go.
Love it. Well, even more of a reason for our listeners to stay tuned. And I just really want to thank you both for joining us for this episode and doing another deep dive into our CEQA series. And I always like to joke that probably one of my more mortifying moments on this podcast was the very first interview I did with Jessa, where I call it my miscongeniality moment, where our most avid listeners would know when we do our wrap-up rapid five for certain series of our podcast, we ask our guests to finish the phrase, "Wouldn't it be nice if?" And instead of having maybe a more idealistic or utopian view, my response was elimination of the fair argument standard.
Yeah.
So fully putting my glasses on. I'm just so thrilled that, really not that many episodes later, we're talking about it and maybe there's some level of optimism that something might come to fruition in the not too distant future. So thank you both so much for joining us and walking our listeners through what the fair argument standard is, what it means, and how we can make it better. So thank you both so much for your time.
Very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to be updated when new episodes are released and leave us a review to let us know what you think. It also really helps us to share the podcast with others who may enjoy learning about the environmental industry. If you want to submit a shout out or any feedback, please send an email or voice memo to podcast@califaep.org. The email again is podcast with an S, podcast@califaep.org.